So in the next set of studies, I was interested in how implicit gender self-stereotyping influences women's career attitudes. However, no implicit career attitude measurements exist in the literature, so in studies 4A and 4B, I use those to develop and calibrate these measurements. So first, I used a set of 84 occupations and pre-tested them for gender relevance, status, and valence. So in study 4B, I was simply interested in gender differences in career beliefs. So I had a sample of men and women complete the study, and I used an IAT again to measure implicit career attitudes. So for this IAT and from the pre-testing from study 4A, I selected 4 physical occupations, which represent traditionally masculine careers. So here it's pilot, ship captain, surgeon, police officer, and 4 nurturing occupations, which were speech therapist, nurse, social worker, and elementary teacher, which represent traditionally feminine occupations. So each of these occupations were selected because they were strongly associated with men versus women, they're high status, and they're positive in valence. So these occupations were paired with the good and bad words from the self-esteem IAT. So lastly, I had participants give self-report ratings for these occupations on a scale of negative to positive as a measurement of explicit career attitudes. In addition, in study 4B, I used an IAT to measure implicit career identification, which is used the same set of occupations, the physical and nurturing from the career attitudes IAT, and rather than using the self and the good and bad words from the previous IAT, this one used the self and other related words. Lastly, I had participants give self-report ratings for these occupations on a scale of not at all interested to very interested as a measurement of explicit career identification. So this is an example of what participants would see in a career identification IAT. Again, they're asked to classify the stimuli as quickly as possible using the 2 blue keys. And in this sample trial, participants would see self and nurturing paired on the upper left-hand part of the screen and other and physical on the upper right-hand part of the screen. In this sample, they would see the word nurse in the center of the screen and need to press the left-hand blue key to associate it with the nurturing category. In this sample trial, the category labels are flip-flopped at the top, and they see the word me in the center of the screen. So participants would need to press the left-hand blue key to classify as part of the self category. So again, the rationale for an IAT is that when highly associated words share the same response key, participants typically classify them quickly and easily. So the career attitude IAT and career identification IAT were very similar, except that one used the self and other words, and one used the good and bad words. So these are the results for the career attitudes outcomes. So first, these are the implicit data. So again, we have IATD scores scored such that higher numbers represent implicit positive feminine attitudes and lower numbers represent implicit positive masculine attitudes. Results reveal that both men and women displayed positive implicit attitudes toward feminine careers, but women do so to a stronger extent. And this implicit attitude score was marginally different from 0 for men and significantly different from 0 for women. Next, we have the explicit career attitudes along the y-axis, and again, I scored these to parallel the IATD scores such that higher numbers represent explicit positive feminine attitudes. And these results reveal that both men and women displayed similar levels of positive explicit attitudes toward feminine careers, and the scores are significantly different from 0 for both men and women. So here I speculate that men display implicit and explicit positive attitudes toward female careers because perhaps our society is open-minded to or even encouraging of the fact that men should be able to pursue traditionally feminine occupations. So this is evident in some TV shows and movies. For example, a TV show called Modern Family portrays a stay-at-home dad, and the movie Meet the Parents, the main character is a male nurse. So these are the results for the career identification outcomes. First, again, is the implicit data. So we have IATD scores along the y-axis here. So they're scored such that higher numbers represent implicit identification with feminine careers and lower numbers represent implicit identification with masculine careers. The results reveal that men display no implicit bias to identify with either type of career, while women strongly implicitly identify with the feminine careers. So there's a significant gender difference here, and the bar for women is significantly different from 0. Next, these are the results for the explicit career identification score to parallel the IATD score. So higher numbers represent more explicit identification with feminine careers. And here the results reveal that men display no explicit bias to identify with either type of career, while women strongly explicitly identify with feminine careers. And there's a significant gender difference here, and the bar for women is significantly different from 0. So again, I speculate here that men display no implicit or explicit bias toward identifying with either type of career because, again, perhaps our society is open-minded to or encouraging of the fact that men should be able to pursue traditionally feminine occupations. So overall, the gender differences on this slide and the slide right before it provide evidence that these career belief measurements that I created are reliable and valid. In addition, in study 4C, I examined the implicit gender self-stereotyping manipulation from studies 1B, 2, and 3, how that impacted these newly developed and calibrated measurements of implicit and explicit career identification and career attitudes. Unfortunately, the implicit gender self-stereotyping manipulation had no impact on these career belief outcomes, on any of them. Let's see here. So, just make sure. Yes. So now I wanted to give a brief interim summary since the results from studies 1B through 4C revealed some inconsistencies in the data. So I wanted to quickly discuss each study, its implicit dependent variable of interest, and the corresponding results. So in study 1B, I used the me, not me task to assess implicit gender self-stereotyping, and the results revealed that women who completed the manipulation displayed stronger implicit gender self-stereotyping relative to the control group. In study 2, I used an IAT to measure implicit gender self-stereotyping, and unfortunately was unable to replicate the results from study 1B. In study 3, I used an IAT to measure implicit self-esteem, and the results revealed that women who completed the manipulation displayed marginally higher implicit self-esteem compared to women in the control condition. Lastly, in study 4C, I used an IAT to measure implicit career identification and career attitudes. These results, unfortunately, revealed that the manipulation did not impact these outcomes of career beliefs. So this mixed evidence motivated me to reevaluate the implicit gender self-stereotyping manipulation paradigm. So since the pilot test for the career belief measurements yielded predicted gender effects for women, I argue that these outcome measures are reliable and valid. In addition, I used in study 3 a highly reliable IAT to measure implicit self-esteem. So because these data inconsistencies are likely not the result of the dependent variables, I argue that it's likely the problem likely stems from the manipulation task for the independent variable. More specifically, the stereotype word presentation duration in the implicit gender self-stereotyping manipulation, if you recall, those word pairs were shown for 1,500 milliseconds per trial. That duration may have allowed participants to thoroughly deliberate about both the meaning of the stereotype and its personal relevance, which wouldn't necessarily activate implicit automatic self-stereotyping associations. So in the final study, I used a different implicit gender self-stereotyping manipulation that utilized subliminal presentation times. And I'm going to discuss that in detail in the upcoming slides. So in study 5, I had a sample of women who I randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions: self-stereotyping condition, a stereotype-only control condition, and a no-stereotype control condition. Then I had participants complete the dependent variables of implicit and explicit self-esteem and career identification. So in this new implicit gender self-stereotyping manipulation, I used a subliminal priming task where the primary goal for participants is to determine if a string of letters is a word. Using two keys on the keyboard, is the string of letters a word? Yes or no? So in the self-stereotyping condition, participants first saw a fixation cross, which would orient their attention to the center of the screen, followed by a string of X's for 1,000 milliseconds. And in the self-stereotyping condition, they were shown a self-relevant subliminal prime. So that was either I, me, or mine for 15 milliseconds, followed by another string of X's for 1,000 milliseconds. Finally, they were shown either a stereotype word, here it's movie, or a non-word. So here you see it's chair, but it's misspelled, so it's a non-word. So once they get to this point in the sequence is where they are determining, is the string of letters you see a word, yes or no? In the stereotype-only control condition, participants completed the exact same task. The only difference was that they did not see, they were not subliminally primed with the self-relevant word, but rather with a neutral word. So that was a, at, or the. Everything else in the sequence was the same. And again, those string of letters before and after the subliminal prime served as the forwards and backwards maps. So Also, lastly, in the third condition, the no stereotype control condition, they didn't complete any version of this manipulation at all. They just simply proceeded to the measurement of the dependent variables. So the results for study 5, these are for the self-esteem outcomes. So these are the results for the implicit self-esteem. So higher numbers here again represent higher implicit self-esteem. And I find that women in the two control conditions, so the no stereotype control and stereotype only control, display relatively high implicit self-esteem, and these two conditions do not differ. However, when women are exposed to these implicit gender self-stereotyping, they show higher implicit self-esteem compared to the two control groups combined. These contrasts were theoretically driven and predicted a priori. However, this effect did not replicate when explicit self-esteem is used as the dependent variable. So these are the results for study 5 for the career identification outcomes. So this is for the implicit data. So again, on the y-axis, we have implicit career identification, IITD scores. So higher numbers, again, represent strong identification with feminine careers. So I find that women in the two control conditions, so the no stereotype control and stereotype only control, display relatively strong implicit identification with feminine careers, and these two conditions do not differ. However, when women are exposed to implicit gender self-stereotyping, they show higher implicit feminine identification with feminine careers compared to the two control groups combined. And again, these were theoretically driven contrast and predicted a priori. However, this effect did not replicate when explicit career identification was used as the dependent variable.